Roxy. Okay, great. How are you doing?
Good morning.
Okay,
Good.
good. Um, so does anyone want to do a little catch up before we start?
I say
Like,
we
how
get
are you
going.
doing? Yes. Okay, great. Okay, great. So we're live now. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. It is an important time that we're having this conversation. The conversation we're having is about how journalism and how reporters essentially today under the current administration are going to be able to work and given the circumstances that are difficult. During the Trump previous presidency, the CFWIJ documented unprecedented attacks on women journalists, from physical assaults to online harassment and smear campaigns. With Trump being back in power, what does that mean for reporting on gender? We're going to talk about that. I do want to briefly go back a little bit and see some of the references that we have from the previous administration that we have taken into account. So, apart from the increased online violence and smear campaigns, the attacks on women journalists during Trump's last stay. There's some noise.
Karan, I don't know if you can hear me. I sent you a message, but we all have lost your sound. So I can hear the others, but we cannot hear you. It's okay. Maybe I can just briefly take it over, Karan, while you go and figure out what's happening. Just quickly to introduce myself, I'm the senior editor with the Women Press Freedom newsroom at the Coalition for Women in Journalism. I've worked with them for the past 2 years. And as Karan mentioned, what we're doing is in this panel, like looking at what journalism, especially for women and LGBTQ journalists, is going to look like in the next 4 years, which is obviously not looking great considering already the things that we've heard, the things we've experienced previously, and then also looking at Project 2025, which was released, and a lot of things are already like set into motion. And I think what would be interesting to hear, so at the coalition, we've like obviously documented a rise in violations previously during the Trump administration. We've also have data that clearly shows that the attacks on women and LGBTQ journalists, whether it's legal, as Cerise has experienced, whether it's surveillance, Cerise also has experienced this, or it's actual violence, has been heightened under Trump. That doesn't mean that during Biden and Harris this wasn't the case at all, but definitely like the difference is quite large. And so I think maybe since we're talking about this, like these kind of direct attack series, maybe introduce yourself and explain to us like how you as a journalist are working through this increasing oppression.
Great. Thanks so much for having me. My name is Cerise Castle. I am a Los Angeles-based journalist, and I work currently for Capital in Maine as a reporter on inequality. And I also cover the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department on a freelance basis. And that work is really where I've seen the most obstacles presented my way. That's included digital and physical surveillance, as Inga was mentioning in the introduction, as well as physical attacks. It was actually being shot with a less lethal munition that pushed me into this work. That gave rise to the situation for me to even pursue this reporting. As far as navigating the oppression, I mean, it's really, I think, first of all, it's important to know like what your own limits are. The things that I've experienced are quite severe. It's, things from having police come to my home to having digital surveillance of anywhere that I am appearing on social media constantly, and to threats of being sued for publishing this information. And I think it's important for journalists to know like what their personal line is. Like, well, I'm perfectly okay with, putting up with all this stuff. Like some people might not, and that's okay. I don't think it's healthy for people to push themselves through this kind of thing and lead to burnout. So there are less journalists. I don't think that's a good idea. I think it's important to know, what your own limits are and to be aware of the risks as well. Before you're going into a situation, you can't always predict what it is going to lead to, but it is important to be aware of things. And if you do find yourself in a situation where you are being subjected to harassment, whether it's physical or digital, it's important to know about resources that are available out there to help you get through it. The CFWIJ, for example, has been really supportive of me, like literally from day one, sending me resources on how to protect myself digitally, things that I can do to protect myself physically, whether that is utilizing resources like Delete Me to remove all of my personal information from the internet to make it harder for people to find me, taking hostile environment for journalist training to know how to physically protect myself in these spaces. All of these are great tools, and I recommend that every journalist is engaging in things like this. Doing risk assessments before you go out and do a story. All of that should be happening, constantly, but especially under an administration like this, it just becomes that much more important because we know that there is an open hostility to journalists, and we can do a lot in advance of like going into these situations to prepare. There's a lot that we can do in the aftermath of situations to take care of each other as well.
Yeah, I think it's really smart. You're back, Karan.
Hi. Sorry, guys. I don't know. I was talking and I don't know what happened. Apologies. Technology. Thank you, Cerise, by the way. Thank you for your insight. And, we are glad to be able to support. We, had been very concerned about you and a lot of other journalists working on the ground. And it seems like, right now we are in that situation where we are having this conversation again. That we are hearing from reporters who are covering important beats like yourself. I know that you have been doing this investigation, which also you received several awards for it on the Sheriff's County, which also got you into trouble, but also your social justice work. So since we are talking to Cerise, we're just going to stick to that, and I will come to Roxy after. What is it like right now for you reporting on the ground, especially when you're working on issues of social justice? What is the environment like, for you as a journalist? What are the conversations that you're having with your colleagues and your editors in this moment?
I would say on the ground with my colleagues, there's a lot of apprehension and nervousness, maybe even fear for some people. It's only been, just a few weeks of the Trump administration, and we've seen a lot of like sweeping orders that have come to pass, many of which were promised either in 2025 or on his campaign. And I think very top of mind for a lot of journalists is this promise to go after reporters, to prosecute them. There are a number of people I work with that during the last administration did a lot of accountability journalism, whether it was around administration nominees, practices by the administration in carrying out their policies that had some pretty big effects, things like people resigning or having policies rewritten. And there's definitely, a lot of nervousness around what that could mean for people. Does that mean that there is a target on their back for this new administration? We've seen Kash Patel's confirmation hearings going forward. We've seen the FBI have these really, frankly, scary things happening. These surveys going out, asking people to self-identify if they participated in investigations over January 6th rioters, insurrectionists. And that tone is, it's scary for people. We're seeing this happening already before this gentleman who was promised to go after reporters going in. We're already seeing this stuff come to pass. So it is very nervous for journalists on the ground. I would say that's the good news is that hasn't stopped anyone. Yes, we are nervous. Yes, there is some fear, but we're not going to stop what we're doing. And I found that when I'm going out into the field and speaking with people, people are very willing to tell their story. People want to tell their story. People are, very eager to show that they are still out there, still doing the work, still living their lives in spite of these policies that are coming down in an attempt to silence and erase them, whether that is day laborers in Pasadena that are working for free to clear out the streets of toxic debris that the city did not remove, that they stepped up to do themselves, whether that is trans people in Los Angeles getting together to educate trans people across the United States on how to get their documents up to date to continue existing in the face of these executive orders that have attempted to erase trans people. The community is strong. The community is still going forward, and the community wants to tell its stories. And there will always be journalists there that are willing to tell those stories, to stand in the face of any administration that is trying to come down hard and end human rights. There will always be journalists there to stand up and fight for them.
I think thank you. I think, and it's good to hear that communities are, sticking around and not getting too discouraged by it. But, I think that, from you lost my voice, and I lost my voice because of internet before, but I was going through some of the cases that we documented the last time, some of them being very visceral. There were physical assaults on journalists as well as verbal. Of course, we are aware of the verbal hostility that journalists face, particularly women of color, which include Yamisha Elsendor from PBS News, Weijia Zhang from CBS News. There was a physical attack as well on a journalist. You might remember Sophie Alexander was physically assaulted by Trump supporters after posing a question to the current president. He was at the time president as well. And she was booed and grabbed by the arm and told, "Get out, you stupid B word." This incident reflects the broader pattern of hostility towards journalists that is now going to be a lot of journalists think is going to be even bolder and more aggressive. Are there any preparations that you have gone through in terms of protecting yourself on the ground?
I think the biggest thing that I've done to prepare myself on the ground is taking hostile environment for journalists courses. I've completed 2, both of which were offered by the International Women in Media Foundation. And there are a lot of really, in retrospect, looking at these tips, very basic things that can be done to protect yourself. Things like doing a risk assessment before you go out. Simplistically, that involves just looking at where you're going, listing all the dangers that could potentially arise, finding your exits, and checking in with yourself and the folks that you are going with about your boundaries. Like, what is something that might happen that means to you, okay, it's time to go? For me, often a lot of the times is is physical touching like that. I am not okay with being touched. That is not what I'm here to do. I'm here to report. There is no reason to touch me. If that's happening, it's time for me to get out of there. That's so important. And when it comes to protecting yourself physically, I think it is in this time important for all journalists to have some sort of physical self-defense in their repertoire. It's sad that it's come to that. I never thought that, as a reporter, I would be saying to my fellow journalists, you need to have some sort of physical fighting skill to do this job. But unfortunately, that's where we are now. And it's important to have that. There have definitely been times that I've been reporting in hostile situations, like a Trump rally in Beverly Hills, for instance, where I was touched, where people did try to attack me. And I'm very grateful that I do have some self-defense training and I was able to get out of that situation and get to safety. It's horrible that this is where we are, but we need to be realistic and take these steps to protect ourselves.
Yeah, thank you. Moving to Roxane Saul. Hi, Roxy. Roxy is a powerhouse journalist and editor who leads the editorial charge at the Miss Magazine, where her visionary coverage advances critical conversations about gender equality, social justice, and human rights. As you all might know, Miss Magazine was founded in 1971. Co-founded by Gloria Steinem, and some of the co-founders still work with Miss and leads some of the, it was also the first feminist magazine in America. So Roxy, we see on a daily basis, you're covering everything that is going on gender, women, LGBTQ, racial democracy issues. When you're leading your coverage in this moment, what are your priorities? What are you thinking about right now?
It's a good point. It's a good question. So, to speak on violence briefly, Ms. is on right-wing media's radar. It always has been. When I worked in the office, we'd get prank calls and really just very misogynistic, kind of coordinated prank call campaigns. And when we write about important people, we get lawsuit threats, and I've had right-wing articles written about, pro-abortion TikToks that I've made. And I mean, especially X since Elon Musk has takeover. I mean, it is a cesspool in our Ms. Magazine comments. And, hearing Cerise talk about physical assaults, it's just, I'm lucky that has never been my experience. And I also feel lucky that I work in a newsroom where we have pro bono attorney who's consulting us on, hey, you should be careful with that sentence before you publish it. And so I do feel kind of protected in that way, that the threats are not coming towards me personally. Typically, like I said, there have been articles written about me in particular. But I felt, and like Cerise said, you kind of have to gauge your own comfort level. So, and we are steeling ourselves, literally, like with our fact-checking operations, we are investing more money in our fact-checking so that we make sure that if we get, lawsuits are going to come, and we want to make sure that at least, we have the legal leg to stand on. Hey, we're sure that the facts we publish in this article are right. And if you're upset about the coverage, that's one thing. But if it's, libelous, that's another. So we meet really regularly with our lawyer. He's feminist, pro bono. We're just really lucky to have that kind of resource. But then also there's this kind of mental stealing that I could hear in Cerise's answer that I think some of us are doing too. And, journalists are scared. And that's exactly what the authoritarians want. They want activists and journalists and feminists to be afraid and silent and siloed, talking not to each other. And it is rebellious to even get on a panel like this and speak openly about this is hard. Yeah. This is scary. We are sad, and I know there was a lot
about it. I will say that we had to, we've been having so many conversations with journalists who, especially the ones in DC, who cover the White House, particularly the ones who are going to White House. They don't want to be they just are being very careful. And I mean, I think this is the first time it's happening in America. It has happened in other parts of the world, something
Right.
that we cover all the time, that we've covered in Turkey, we've covered in Egypt, I myself has seen in Pakistan and Turkey when I worked there. So this is a dynamic that happens where journalists become more careful. There is, like Cerise also mentioned, there's this resilience that we will go out there and we will cover these things. And I think that this is not just an attack on the press. This is an attack on communities, on gender, on things that make democracy stronger, right? Equality, equity, these
Totally.
issues. So I think that there is also a sense of resilience amidst all of those communities that are affected. They're aware that this is happening, and there will be, I suppose that resilience is also something that is felt. Roxy, like, I wonder, I'm sure, like, when this election results came in last year, you guys sat and thought about how you're going to cover. You already know these are going to be the priorities because this is what happened before. This is going to be under attack. What does your coverage look like for women? And when do you work with women journalists? What is that experience like covering
Sure.
gender?
So, the problem right now is that Trump is kind of flooding the media zone. So we don't know where to, journalists as we collectively don't know where to look. It's like horrible things are happening over here. Horrible things are happening over here. And so, the two things that kind of give me and Ms. Staffer's focus is, we only cover feminist stories, explicitly feminist angles. So, we haven't yet covered the January 6th pardons, but we have covered his anti-abortion FACE Act pardons, because that is the angle that we feel is more feminist. It's more impacting women and girls and people that need abortion care. So that's kind of one thing that's keeping me sane here is, like, I'm reading all the mainstream coverage and I'm thinking, okay, what's the feminist angle here? And then secondly, sort of related to that, Ms. practices movement journalism. So it's movement in seeking political, social, or economic change. And typically that means that we would cover a badly reported or underreported story. So again, that's why we covered these anti-abortion pardons, because we wanted to emphasize the impact of what this is going to have on anti-abortion violence and how emboldened they're going to feel. You saw the commentary from the DOJ that said, basically, we're not even going to be enforcing the FACE Act unless, and they mentioned death. So what's this going to take? Someone has to die again, So it's just terrible. But I would say some of the kind of focus areas that Ms. is we just did have an in-staff, all team meeting a couple weeks ago. And some of those angles are anti-abortion violence, keeping track. Ms. is published by the Feminist Majority Foundation, and it also oversees the National Clinic Access Project. So we have a ton of sources of abortion providers, and we're going to, really ramp up our coverage of that, because right wing is certainly covering, FACE Act and, the DOJ brought charges and we're just innocent people praying outside of a clinic. No, they're not. They are chaining themselves together. They are hurting staff members, physically hurting them. And, so we have to correct the narrative. And that's an example of something that's maybe badly reported or underreported or being covered by the right wing in a way that is not feminist or even accurate. So there's,
I feel like a lot of... Yeah, go on.
I
was thinking, like, there's a lot of focus on misinformation, right? Because what happens is misinformation gaslights the narrative, it gaslights issues. And then we are kind of gaslit and sort of responding constantly to that. But I think what's great is that Miss Magazine, I think what I'm hearing from you is, like, there's a lot of focus on doing explainers and explaining what actually happened.
Yes.
In a way, countering that misinformation, not really responding to those things that are happening, but more like going in and saying, hey, this is the alternative picture, this is the real picture, this is what's happening in actuality. Is that
totally? Yes, for sure.
Right.
For sure.
And also, I mean, I thought that be one way to look at it is to look at what is winning. Sometimes we have in the past gotten caught up with Trump and everything, so we're constantly, the media is covering what happened. I think what is also good to report on is what is winning, what is working.
Yes.
Who are the journalists on the ground? Like we're speaking to Cerise, right? Like she's on the ground, she's doing it, and it doesn't matter what Trump is doing, because she is there on the ground doing the work. There are some women leaders in social justice and feminist space who are doing the work. So like
And
covering
in,
that.
blue states, New York, Connecticut, California, Illinois, there are some really strong feminist governors and lawmakers and elected officials that are doing really cool, interesting things with the law, and that we need to make sure that we're lifting up, because if we only lift up the bad things that are happening, which typically are happening in the Southeast, and Texas and Louisiana, you'll see copycat bills introduced in one, and it's exactly the same written in another state, and so we have to do that in a positive way too. So, hey, this is what Illinois is doing, and maybe New Mexico didn't think about that, or maybe Vermont is thinking, this is a push that we need, and so we want to push the right people too, not just these emboldened incels on the internet that are feeling like there's no consequences. Feminist and pro women's rights leaders should also feel emboldened right now. Sad too, of course. I think we're all sad. Like Cerise said, we're all scared, but we kind of have to channel that into something positive, and this is the current issue of Ms. Magazine. It says rolling up our sleeves. So this is kind of the focus. We're putting it out in four parts. 2 parts came out last week and 2 parts are coming out this week. And it's documenting the feminist resistance that is fomenting in response, because it is his second time in office. And, the good news for him, unfortunately, is that he knows how this job works. He knows how to do things a little bit faster, but so do we, and in Project 2025, he lined out what he's going to do, and 75% of his executive actions are basically word for word from Project 2025. And so it's really comforting, helps me sleep at night thinking that there are these badass feminist lawyers, feminist elected officials that are like, we are ready. We are, the lawsuit is typed. We're just submitting it. He did that. We have this. There's all these pathways that have been sort of practiced, and everyone's kind of going through the steps that they know. And so anyone listening should know that, someone is at the helm. And if you don't hear about it, things are happening in state courts, federal courts, maybe at the Supreme Court soon. But, we're not holding our breath there. But things are happening, in liberal and progressive people are doing the work.
Yeah. And also read Ms. Magazine and read what's happening. What are women talking about? What are anyone who's under attack? I think like maybe media coverage should be slightly better, because right now it's a lot of reaction to Trump. I'll move to Inge, our wonderful editor at Women Press Freedom, at the Coalition for Women and Journalists, Women in Journalism. Inge, to introduce Inge, she is a distinguished journalist and advocate for press freedom. Since 2023, she served as a lead at the Women Press Freedom in a newsroom at the Coalition for Women in Journalism, where she has worked on groundbreaking initiatives to support and amplify the voices and needs of women journalists globally. Thank you so much, Inge, for joining this conversation. You are looking, on a daily basis, you look at the globe and you look at press freedom attacks on women journalists, and you understand in the main 55 categories that we document violence against women journalists. So you kind of have a landscape view. As Donald Trump gets elected in America, which is seen as a democratic power around the world, what are you thinking about, and what's on your mind right now as far as press freedom, gender goes?
Big question, because of course there's so many things happening. I think one of the things that we need to understand, so I'm not based in the US. I'm not from the US. It's actually night here right now. And in the work that I've been doing as a journalist, I've never focused on one specific space. I've always like looked at different places. And I think one of the things that is very, very clear is that although the United States as a democratic power is not necessarily respected as much like that around the world, I do think we need to acknowledge that what happens in the United States is sometimes taken as a carte blanche for other regimes. Like, oh, but they're doing it in the United States, so we can do it too. So that's why I think looking at it globally, it gives authoritarian regimes like we see in Hungary, we see in Georgia, we see in many different spaces, it gives them more power to suppress the press even more. And so I do think that is a very important marker. And then secondly, when it comes to gender, and again, this is internationally, this is like, yeah, it's happening in the States, but it's everywhere else as well, that we see a massive move against anything that has to do with equality or uplifting voices that are unheard or not heard as much as they are supposed to. Again, this is like a global movement that we're seeing, especially like women journalists, LGBTIQ journalists are specifically repressed. And then, of course, the stories that they're telling are repressed even more. With the situation in the United States, however, and I think Roxy mentioned this really well, is that at least what we've seen in the last 2 weeks is that, yes, a lot of things happen, but they were predicted already by them, right? It's like they're following the playbook. So if you haven't read Project 2025 yourself, like just... It's a lot. It's 600 pages. So maybe you don't want to, but like look it up and figure out what are the things that are going to happen. So when it comes to executive orders, I feel like we already know it's happening. When it comes to gender specifically, not just like reporting, like both reporting on it and being a woman and LGBTIQ journalist, is we see attacks. Like when it came to the attacks on women and LGBTIQ journalists in the first Trump presidency, it was massive compared to the kind of violence that was directed towards men. And so 100% that's going to like increase again. I mean, that's like, at least, I think we all feel it, because already now we're seeing how the minorities are being taken. Like CDC has just been ordered to take out all the biological references to male and females. Born as a female apparently cannot be put in a research paper because the government is trying to erase any kind of gender non-conforming language. And so as journalists, obviously, you take a brunt. And I think, thanks for people like Cerise who are actually going to these kind of like places like the Trump rallies where you are putting yourself in danger. But if you're not going, it's not going to be covered. So,
or covered right, covered correctly.
Yes,
it's going to be covered by our enemies, by someone that's looking to skew the narrative in this certain way to serve their interests. So totally.
Exactly. Yeah, 100%. So yeah, big question. And I hope I kind of like was able to give that global lens to it.
I mean, it also covered, I will say that you also published this big report with the team that you worked on, which was focused on comparing, because at the time we were doing this before the elections, looking at Kamala Harris and Donald Trump's record. Could you tell us a little bit about that report and what you saw were problematic in the main problematic areas under Trump?
Yeah, definitely. So I think one of the reasons we wanted to do this report, where we just look at press freedom violations under the Trump administration and then press freedom violations under Biden and Harris. The reason we wanted to do it because there were press freedom violations during the Harris campaign as well. But we wanted to make sure that we pose it in a such a way that we could really see, like, okay, so where does the danger lie with Trump coming in? Because what we saw mostly during Biden and Harris, it was It was law enforcement, of course, which was larger under Trump, but the biggest one was law enforcement and legal harassment. Legal harassment being trying to, and that is not necessarily have anything to do specifically with the executive system, because it was mostly like courts, right? Like court cases where judges were trying to get sources from journalists, whistleblowers, and that kind of thing. But what we then did was, like, after like looking at the data, which I mean obviously clearly shows that the difference in press freedom violations is massive. And I think what the dangerous thing is that we are, during the previous Trump presidency, I would say the majority was like misogynistic comments, or like your fake news. It was dismissive of women and minority journalists. It was there was like of course like the law enforcement part. But when we were looking at Project 2025, I think the most important takeaway from that is, like, again, looking forward, is that the legal harassment cases are going to skyrocket likely, because parts of the Project 2025, which we know is going to like probably be executed like step by step soon, is actually giving the legal rights to law enforcement to surveil journalists, to force journalists to give up their anonymous sources, the whistleblowers, and to potentially also make it a criminal offense to not share your sources. And I think the fact this kind of legal harassment already happened, right? Also happened under Biden, Harris.
Biden, Harris kind of also were on the same.
Yeah, but I would say the difference is that what we're going to see now, at least this is my assumption, is that by legalizing those things even more, it's just going to skyrocket. And the issue here then is, of course, that whistleblowers don't want to come forward anymore because their anonymities cannot be protected. When that happens, journalists cannot hold the powerful to account. If your sources don't want to talk to you because they're worried that they're going to be exposed, that is a massive danger to freedom of information that the public has. So I think, I would say that's like the main thing. Like, we already saw, of course, the legal harassment and surveillance under Biden and Harris as well. But what is going to happen likely is that this is going to be emboldened by actually making it part of the legal framework, like allowing this more.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm hearing from some newsrooms in the US that are preparing, bigger budgets for legal support. That's one of the main things. The way some newsrooms who can't afford to are responding that way, but then you have smaller newsrooms that are nervous about it, because certainly legal harassment is something that is going to be used as a tool, has been used before. And coming back to Cerise on that, she was Cerise, you were harassed by the sheriff's office. I mean, I'm wondering, I know you briefly touched upon that. Is it possible for you to share a little bit about what you think was really going on from sheriff's side in terms of his office using his power, over you? What was going on in that encounter?
Absolutely. So shortly after publishing my series in 2021, which was titled A Tradition of Violence, and that series looked at the 50-year plus history of criminal gangs forming and operating within the sheriff's department.
This is a podcast series.
It is a podcast series, yes, as well as a written series, and a forthcoming book that I should also mention.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Look forward to it.
Thank you. But pretty quickly after that series was published, I was contacted by several sources inside the department that were concerned for my safety because they were seeing personal photos of mine appearing in their stations on bulletin boards, things like that. And I myself actually saw a picture of myself at the Hall of Justice, which is where the Sheriff's Department is housed. that prompted me, after receiving those tips, that prompted me to file a public records request to the Sheriff's Department requesting all communications that had been made within the department that contained my name in it. And they did not want to give me that information. It took about 3 years in court to fight with them with the support of a team of attorneys to get that information. And eventually we did get it. And we received over 800 pages of documents that had been generated in just a 6-month period that all had my name on them. And this included, personal quips from sheriff's deputies that were criticizing my reporting, criticizing me as a person, calling into question my ethics and morality for doing this reporting. There were remarks made about people they thought that were friends of mine doing full background checks on people that they assumed were people that I had some sort of personal connection with based on what I was posting on social media. There was emails detailing that there was several crime analysts, they call them, that were assigned to monitor my social media accounts. They were doing workup reports on what I was posting on social media. And I think the most concerning for me personally was my information being sent to the unit that monitors license plates and tracks where people are moving throughout Los Angeles County. And that information was sent to a number of different police departments. It confirmed for me a lot of suspicions that I had, because there had been a number of questionable interactions that I had with members of different police departments, whether that was them, popping up and pulling me over right after I had, conducted an interview that with a confidential source, or even people that I talked to literally being shot by members of the Sheriff's Department after I had spoken to them. Seeing all that information in writing just confirmed my suspicions that I was under surveillance, and that it was not just me, but it was people that the Sheriff's Department thought were in my circle.
Yeah. And Cerise, I will say that when we were covering our case, I remember like one day after another, like every few weeks, there was something going on. And we were like, I will say this was one of the first very rare times where we noted that in United States, there was something going on in a county of the scale that usually happens in India, or like the kind of way that a government or an official can harass a journalist and just bully them and go after them and monitor them. And then it seemed like they were strategically targeting you because there was an escalation of things. There was one thing after another. And when you looked at it, eventually in a time frame, it was very clear that it was planned and it was strategic. And this was something that was one of the very rare cases, that we saw in the United States, where a county sheriff would go after a journalist this way.
Yeah. And I also want to mention that it wasn't just me. The Sheriff's Department has a history at this point of going after women journalists. Maya Lau, who covered the Sheriff's Department at the Los Angeles Times for many years, it came out last year that the Sheriff's Department had taken 3 years to pursue a criminal investigation of her because she had written a story that spoke about deputy gangs and how the sheriff, the head of the department, his role and his administration's role in the growth and promotion of deputy gang culture. Eileen Chekmedian, who succeeded Maya Lau at the Los Angeles Times, covering the Sheriff's Department. The sheriff at the time, Alex Villanueva, held an entire press conference where he had Eileen's photo up on the dais with him and was making these really disgusting insinuations that she was a criminal for continuing that investigatory work into the department. I'm not alone in this. There are other women I can name as well. Kate Cagle at Spectrum News 1, Carrie Blakinger, who now covers the Sheriff's Department. Every day I see Alex Villanueva criticizing Carrie, saying horrible things about her because of things in her personal life. It's disgusting that these are government officials that are engaging in this kind of material and are using the apparatus of the department behind them to carry this stuff out.
Mhm. I mean, I can't help but say that thank you for those that insight series. I will say that we started doing the monitoring and documenting only 5 years ago, and I will say that there has been, usually when you see these kind of incidences, you know that it has been well practiced before. The sheriff, it's not something new that they're doing it out of the blue. It's something that they have honed over time. And I think that that kind of also brings the question of when women journalists get targeted, it doesn't get documented, it doesn't get heeded by, by larger advocacy groups. A lot of the reason is that what's happening on the ground, a lot of times women don't share. It all goes back into the whole ecosystem, how women about how women are supported in newsrooms, in the industry, what kind of networks they have to seek that kind of support. So I think that, and then I will say that, your case came into our radar because this is when we were working. But certainly it was clear that this is something seems to be that has been well practiced before. You were mentioning, we're running out of time. We also started a little late, but I want to do a one round with everyone before we fold. And Cerise, you mentioned something about Naomi Klein's, doppelganger. I wonder if you want to touch on that and any last notes that you had.
Of course. And I love Naomi Klein. I just need to say that.
Yeah.
Her writing has been so helpful to me in this time. I was just saying, to piggyback off of something that Roxy said earlier about knowing your angle and the importance of that, and tying it into Naomi Klein's writing, where she's written for years about, these populist leaders coming in and issuing these sweeping rulings to confuse the public as well as dominate the media churn. And that confusion and that domination on so many different things, as Roxy said, people are sort of scrambling to figure out like what to cover and when to cover it, that sort of thing. And I think it's so important, as she said, to know your angle and to have your specialty. If we have lots of different journalists covering very specific angles, I think it's a great way to make sense of the deluge that we face in this 24-hour news cycle with someone like Donald Trump in the presidential office. And I think that also underscores the importance of having a large press corps, of having a lot of different media institutions that are covering things from very different and specific angles. As well as highlighting the importance of local journalism to talk about how these big sweeping rulings from a national level trickle down and operate in your community. Unfortunately, we're seeing a decimation of the journalism industry by far, year after year, especially when we're seeing these tech giants, these tech oligarchs like Jeff Bezos running the Washington Post, Dr. Patrick Soon-Shiong running the Los Angeles Times, and capitulating, trying to kiss the ring of the ruler. It's horrible, and it's very scary. It's very reminiscent of early 1930s Germany, what happened to the press there. And again, just for everyone watching, it's so important to support journalists, to support local journalists. So there are places to get real facts, to get real information, so we can have an informed public, and that protects democracy.
Yes, great, all great points, Cerise. Thank you. I don't even want to start with the billionaires and all that, that power circle that's going on. Roxy, what would you like to say?
I guess a case study that I'm really heartened by, and I think that proves that storytelling matters and that people-focused reporting matters. So I'm based in Austin, Texas. We have a total ban on abortion in effect. The Center for Reproductive Rights has done some really creative legal, gymnastics to try to get the Texas Supreme Court to intervene. You all saw all this ProPublica reporting showing these Texas women that have been literally dying. And I covered that story at the Texas Supreme Court last summer during the hearing when the women shared their stories. And, one of the women, Samantha Cassiano, she's couldn't afford to travel out of state. And she was pregnant with a baby with anencephaly, developing without a brain, without fetal tissue. This baby had, this fetus had 0% survival once it was born. And her, she and the Center for Reproductive Rights have been putting these women everywhere at the South by Southwest. They're doing Instagram lives. They're at the DNC. They are everywhere. And I'm telling you, as someone that lives in Texas, their stories are taking effect. It's just taking longer than we as journalists would like it to take. We want our reporting to come out and be like, the change needs to happen. But, women are putting their kids in school. They're going to their second job. It takes a while for these stories to take effect. But I don't know if y'all saw, but the Texas Tribune reported a couple weeks ago that Dan Patrick, the lieutenant governor here, he said that the legislature should clarify the abortion law to protect mothers at risk. Now, I know the bar is on the floor, but as someone who lives in Texas who's thinking about being pregnant sometime soon, probably during the Trump administration, I am terrified to be pregnant in the state because it's not just women that want abortions that are being denied abortions. It's women that are pregnant that want this baby very badly, but they're having a miscarriage. There was no reason for Dan Patrick to weigh in, really. He didn't need to, because the Texas Supreme Court ruled late last year that the women suing the state did not have a case. They dismissed their case. And so Dan Patrick, he is not a feminist. He is not a women's rights advocate. And the fact that he went on a radio show and said, hey, the legislature, they just gavelled in. They need to do something about this. And the Republicans here, the one who, Brian Hughes, he did SB 8. He was kind of the mastermind behind the bounty hunter law that we have in effect here. He's like, absolutely not. So anyway, rifts are happening even among Republicans. And the reason is storytelling. It's that women are finally being like, wait a minute. It's not just abortion that's being affected. It's women's health. It's actual wanted pregnancies. And the more we can tell these stories, it's like you're just banging against a wall, but it's chipping. And you have to see these kind of fissures in our opposition and try to cram them open, because that's what they do. Dems in disarray. We have to show that anyway, that our storytelling and that the fact that these people went through such pain is not for nothing,
Yeah, and you're absolutely right about opening it, because I think that's what the power of storytelling is. That's why journalism is important. Is sometimes when people get confused, like I would say, just Republican women. Republicans also have women, and they're also affected by this. Apart from that, apart from some of the issues that they're narratively are not affected by, there are things that it would affect their lives in terms of equality and all of that. And I think journalism is what is there, like, as a hope to cover that. And for that reason, we need to make sure that journalists are protected, that journalists have a community, that journalists have the support that they need, they have the legal support and the institutional support that they need. Inge, I would move to you and ask you how you want to, is there something that you want to share for, from this conversation, what journalists can do, what women journalists can do, with the concerns that are ongoing for them?
Well, I think what is very important right now, especially, I think the last few months, because this is not, again, United States, because what's happening in the United States is impacting everyone around the world. Like, I'm hearing from all the communities I have, how the United States right now is going down is worrying everyone. And so I cannot imagine what it's even like to be a journalist right now in the United States, because if I'm depressed and I'm not even living there, it must be 10 times worse, right? And I think it can be very daunting and scary. And maybe to the point even where, and I just want to share this with all the journalists out there in the United States, that it's okay to be depressed a little bit. But I saw a really, really good video the other day about how in the 80s there were the HIV marches by gay rights activists. They would march all day, and then at night they would go party and have fun. And so I think what we want to take away from this is, yes, you can be depressed, but don't let them take your fun away. Because if you don't have the fun, the work is not going to happen. So allow yourself also to feel happy. Allow yourself to take your mind away. And so with the coalition, we've been working also on a mental health guideline that hopefully can help. But for today, my main one is allow yourself to have fun, and don't let them take that away from you, because you'll have way more power and spirit to continue the fights.
Yeah, that's the best takeaway. Thank you so much, Ange. And fun and community, working, with each other, that brings the joy. I don't want to say much as I fold, but I can't help myself but just mention briefly that I was in Europe the last 2 months before, just the last 2 months, like, and then when I arrived, Donald Trump had already gotten elected. But during that time, I was mostly meeting European leaders. Majority of them happened to be women, because we work on gender and press freedom. So, I was meeting women leaders, including the president of the European Parliament and the cabinet members, who are working on gender and immigration and some of these issues that impact journalists and their freedom. And of course, Donald Trump was coming into power during this time. This is December and early Jan. Is that everyone in Europe, some of the leaders who are looking at democracy and the institutions of democracy, are nervous, and that women, even abroad, even in one of the other Western locations on this planet where democracy happens to be stable, which is Europe, are nervous about Trump coming into power, because they think that it's going to have a reaction back home. So they are also working together to work stronger, on building a stronger institution to be able to counter that. So that's one of the other positive reactions, I think, that is taking place in the world, where you are seeing some of the women, and these are all women, who are kind of coming together, and they're like thinking about, okay, how are we going to make sure that what is happening in America doesn't happen in Europe? And I think for me, as someone who wants good policies for journalists and press freedom and democracy and women and gender, this is something that is to be hopeful for. That's all. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining, and thank you for everything that all of you do.
Bye, y'all. Thank you so much.
Thank you so
Bye.
much.